E esse evento está maravilhoso, né? Acho que está todo mundo aproveitando bastante, né, as várias facetas desse evento. E agora a gente vai ter a oportunidade de escutar de um dos grandes especialistas do mundo em relação ao tópico de mudança climática, né? A gente vai falar dessa mega tendência que, infelizmente, vai impactar a vida de bilhões de pessoas no mundo, né? Seja pelo ponto de vista de terem que se mudar de onde vivem, né, por conta de aumento do nível do mar, ou seja, pelos problemas e desastres climáticos que estão cada vez mais comuns. O Parag também é autor de vários livros, né, um deles falando sobre Ásia. Ele é um dos maiores especialistas de Ásia no mundo. A gente estava conversando antes de começar como, né, o mundo já mudou para um mundo mais focado, mais centrado na Ásia, e o impacto que isso vai ter para todo o restante do mundo. E ele estava dizendo, né, que a gente, no Brasil, focou bastante na China, mas que agora o Brasil também tem que olhar para outras oportunidades na Índia, em outros países asiáticos, porque, de fato, é ali que está mais de 50% da população do mundo e onde o mundo cresce, né? Então, de fato, acho que a gente vai aprender bastante com o Parag. A gente também tem algo muito em comum, somos fãs de tênis, né? A gente estava conversando aqui antes de começar, enfim, ele é um jogador de tênis e a gente estava conversando sobre esse tópico, mas não é o tópico do nosso painel. A gente vai falar sobre essa mega tendência de mudança climática e agora vou passar a palavra aqui para o Parag for you to start your panel. Thank you very much, Parag. And if you want to stand up, please.
Thank you so much. I think from what I heard, you already covered my whole talk. But good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to return to Brazil. I have been coming here for at least 20 years, actually, and had the great privilege to travel around the country and to witness the incredible story, in a way, of Brazil. When you live in America, those who appreciate Brazil will call it the America of South America. For me now, as a global traveler, I come to Brazil and I say this is a global power in many ways. And global power is not something that is simply understood in military terms. It's what roles you play in the global system that defines how important you are. It's not how big your army is necessarily. Brazil's military right now is more active in Brazil than anywhere else in the world. And yet still, Brazil, of course, is a global power. Your industry is obviously one of the major reasons why. Agriculture, agribusiness. But to understand it fully and why Brazil is so important, we have to think about agriculture in the context of the entire global system and the complex dynamics within that system. That's what I want to talk to you about today. So let's get started. I just used the word complexity. It's a word that you might hear a lot, and you might just say, oh, well, things are complicated, things are messy. But complexity is not a synonym for those things. Complexity is one degree, one order of magnitude more challenging to comprehend. Complexity has a literal, mathematical, physical meaning. And it also is a very useful way to understand the real world. In the real world, you cannot simply talk about economics, politics, technology, demographics, climate, as if they are separate conversations, right? In a complex world, each of those things affects the other things, and it is very, very difficult to understand how and even why. In a complex world, you can look backwards and see how and why certain things happened, but it's very difficult to understand what will come next, because the future never looks exactly like the past. And that's the kind of world we are in today. What are the connections between the demographics and the politics and the geopolitics and the economy, right? Teasing it out is the job of, that is something that everyone needs to do. You cannot wait for an oracle, an expert, your leaders to do it for you. From where you sit in the heart of the agricultural industry here, you have to go out and understand what are the economic conditions over there, the geopolitical conditions there, the demographic conditions there, the supply chain issues here, the climate risk there, and piece it all together and then say, what does it mean for me? In a complex system, everyone is an agent. Everyone is a player. What you do actually impacts the system, and the system impacts you. All of that is part of understanding, of truly understanding complexity, which is why we're taking this big step back. Right? Now, I'll give you an example of just how, in a way, challenging and frustrating it is to try to understand complexity. This slide argues that we are in an inflationary world, right? Everything is getting more expensive. And there are very good reasons why. Reason number one, climate change. Very disruptive to the stable geographies of growth, forcing up prices, there are supply chain disruptions. Geopolitics is inflationary. Regional clusters, rivalries, inefficiencies, distortions, protectionism, tariffs, costs go up. Demographics, the world is aging, there are labor shortages, wages have to rise. And fiscal and monetary policy, cyclically, can be inflationary as well, pumping money into the system through what was called quantitative easing, right, and stimulus, for example. So, does anyone disagree? We're in an inflationary environment, right? Nothing to argue with. Okay, but now we're not. Now we're in a deflationary environment. So, it depends, doesn't it? Plenty of good reasons why we're in a deflationary world too. Equally persuasive. We have technology. Everything is getting cheaper. Your processing power of computers and chips, and yet the phone keeps getting cheaper. The cameras are better too. Globalization. More trade networks, more complementarities, right? Lower labor costs, deflationary. Demographics. An aging population can also mean less demand for certain goods and services. We have excess capacity, partially because of automation, leading to such rapid output. Look at China. China is aging, the workforce is shrinking, but their output is going way, way higher because of robots, right? And then, of course, macroeconomics in a recession means people want to save and consume less. Higher interest rates also reducing leading to less demand. So again, anyone disagree? I don't hear a lot of argument. Which is it? So that's complexity. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? You have to hedge your bets. You have to play both sides. You have to build scenarios to be prepared for either direction, or 5 other things that might happen that I haven't thought of yet, and you haven't thought of yet. And that is the world of today. And it's not going to get any easier. Let's look at geopolitics as another example of how complex the world has become. A lot of people say, geopolitics, no problem. 19th century Britain, 20th century America, 21st century China. Ta-da, so easy. Other people say, no problem. Geopolitics is simple. America, China, split the world into blue, red, new Cold War, right? Also very simple. Both of those are also probably wrong. When you take a systems approach to understanding geopolitics, you come up with a pretty different map or diagram. This is mine. Note, of course, a prominent place for Brazil, of course. Now, what is different about the 21st century so that you cannot simply say it will be like the 20th century or like the 19th century? Well, there's major differences. First of all, in this diagram, what you see is every region actually matters. In the past, people would refer to South America or to Africa as peripheral, marginal, colonies. Today, every region, every continent has a voice, has its own voice, has agency, is a part of the system, on its own free will. Secondly, this is empty. Nobody gets to tell you what to do. Nobody gets to say, you, Brazil, cannot have those trade agreements with China. You can't set up those internet cables to Africa. You can't have direct airline connections around the world. You can't connect your stock exchange to other markets. Yes, you can. You can do whatever you want in this world. And everyone is doing whatever they want. Can't you see? Russia wants to invade Ukraine, it invades Ukraine, right? This kind of thing. There is no single policeman at the center. Maybe we thought that might become true in the 1990s. That feels like a really long time ago. So the world is a marketplace. Geopolitics is a marketplace. That's what I call it, the geopolitical marketplace. And every country is either a producer or a consumer, right? And what's really happening is that major powers, including Brazil, are competing to be the preferred supplier, the preferred vendor. Vendor of what? Some countries will launch other satellites. India has started doing that. Others will build your infrastructure. China is doing that. Brazil will provide you all the food you ever needed, right? Countries are competing to lay fiber optic internet cables, to build data centers, military equipment. For everything, there is a marketplace now. And countries are deciding who do they want to partner with. In the old world, you might say, you must choose. You must choose Soviet Union or America, China or America, right? Today, no, it's a marketplace. And so the smart countries will practice what I call multi-alignment, right? Why should you choose one side when you can play all sides? You should have good relations with America, good relations with China, good relations with Saudi Arabia, good relations with India, good relations with Russia. If that is your choice, get used to this. You are a pioneer of it. Your diplomatic service, Itamaraty, I've spent a lot of time with them actually over the years in Brasilia and meeting your fine diplomats around the world. You have been a leader. You are part of the reason we have this marketplace. Brazil has not been for 20 years passively waiting to see if this world emerges. You are part of the reason we have this map and not the simple map where either America or China are in charge. That's complexity. You are a subject, you are an object, right? You are a player on the stage. And that's how this has come about, because of Brazil, because of India, and all the other countries at the same time. I promise you this will not change either. So we may not be able to predict who is aligning with whom at any given time. You can freely associate and connect. But the structure is going to be this. No one will ever tolerate one country sitting at the center. You would know, Indians know, we've been through 500 years of colonialism or Cold War, right? Any leader alive today, which in most of the world, and most of the world is former colonial colonies, right, realizes that their 500 years of history is colonialism or Cold War. Why would they want to repeat that, right? So this is the result of everyone waking up individually, Indians waking up, and Brazilians waking up, and Saudi Arabians waking up and saying, we would prefer this. And so you make this, and that's why it stays this way. So it doesn't matter who wins the US election. It doesn't matter who succeeds Xi Jinping in China. You're not going to sit and wait. You're going to be a player in the game, and that's why we have this. Now, you are, of course, the central anchor and pillar of this vast, incredible continent of South America. And I've always felt that in this new world, where every continent, where every region matters, one of the most important things is to have peace, stability, prosperity in your own backyard. Whenever countries are rising up and claiming leadership, like India, like Brazil, like Saudi Arabia, like Russia, I always say, wait, do they have their own house in order? Because who will trust a country to be a global leader if it has not well organized its own region, its own neighborhood, and is respected and trusted in its own region? And here I think actually you're doing well. I actually remember my first travels here in the 20-something years ago, and my first stop was actually Caracas. And at the time, people told me, you are going to be amazed at Chavez's Bolivarian socialist revolution. It will transform South America, it will transform the world. It will be a rival to America. And then I went there, and I was very scared. I'm not normally afraid, but I was very afraid. And after about 2 weeks, I left. I said, please never, never, ever make me go back there. And we see, sadly, tragically, what has happened. But Brazil is a different story, because here you see a steady, steady, steady progress. And I'm old enough, we're old enough to remember going to places 20 years ago that were full of potential and have fallen apart. Very sad. But many, many countries in the world that I've seen collapse or decay. Take Iraq or Libya, or you could even say Russia and Venezuela. But to be that anchor, right, you have to have that constancy, that reliability. And Brazil is getting there. My main piece of advice is the same as it has been for a long time, which is that when the going is good, when commodities prices are high, when oil prices are high, you must take that money and invest in everything else. That's called counter-cyclical spending, right? Invest in the diversification, invest in the infrastructure, invest in the social policy, in education. And I think you know, in truth, if you look at the domestic scorecard in Brazil, as a huge country, you haven't done enough of that. And so I don't have new advice there. It's to follow this time-tested principle. When the going is good, save, invest, save, invest. And you need that more than ever, because investment and diversification are a source of resilience. Strong, regional relations, good relations with all your neighbors, productive relations with all your neighbors are how you achieve resilience. That's why we're now going to look at Asia. Over on the other side of the world, I actually live in Singapore, right here on the bottom of this map in the Straits of Malacca. If you drill a hole through Singapore, through the earth, and come out the other side, you actually come out on the border between Colombia and Brazil. Did you know that? Yeah. So when I fly, it's a very long way to come here. So I had plenty of time to think about this. And so here we are on the opposite side of the world from where I live, the geography that I now call home. And here is a region. If you look on this map, right here, this rectangle, the world, the globe is a sphere. Here we're just looking at one rectangle, except this rectangle has 60% of the human population. It has about 55% of the world economy. This is the center of the world. If there was one place in the center of my other map, that spider web, if I had to put something in the center, it wouldn't be a flag, but it would be a region, and it would be Asia. And you noticed actually I had circles both for West Asia and East Asia. I could even add one for South Asia. That's how vast this region is. They too are emerging from 500 years of colonialism and Cold War. And in the last 30 years, what they have realized is we must exploit our complementarities, right? So many people, 40 countries, such an obvious comparative advantage where the industry is, where the technology is, where the capital is, talent, demographics, right? Take advantage of that. And in the last 25 years, you've had the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. You had, excuse me, the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. You had, before that, you had the financial crisis of 2008. So Asian financial crisis of the late 90s, global financial crisis of 2008, Trump and Brexit in 2016, and COVID in 2020. Every time there's been a crisis, a shock, Asian countries have been very, very smart. So the solution is to depend less on Western capital, depend less on exporting to the West, do more to integrate internally, regionally. And now, the trade among countries on this map is 65% of their total trade. Think of Europe. When we all look at Europe, we see the European Union, we see a common currency, common institutions. Nobody is surprised when you hear that 70% of European trade is internal. Everybody knows that. But you are surprised when you hear that that's also becoming true in Asia. They are doing a lot to push that in the food and agriculture and commodities and energy system as well. Bringing down those barriers, building oil and gas pipelines, building electricity grids, right? Building roads and railways, moving food, fuel, commodities across borders. Of course, because they are so big, because there are so many billions of people, because their economies are growing so fast, because their nutritional achievements are rising, they will also import from Brazil, but they will also produce and trade more as well. Which is why I often say that the rest of the world is making for Asia. Again, I think you already know that. That is actually part of the reality. I can tell you that that will continue to be true, even though they are also trying to optimize their own internal dynamics. And I know from conversations with many people in Brazil as well that whereas in the past, and I remember conversations here 20 years ago, it was all about China. Right? Focus on China, export to China, trade with China, take capital from China. Now I know, and you see, you also want to have relations, stronger relations with Southeast Asian countries, with India, and even with the West Asian countries. That's very smart. All of these regions are growing fast. I sometimes show a triangle spanning Central Asia, the former Soviet republics here, the West Asian Gulf countries, the Arab Gulf countries, and Southeast Asia here. And this triangle, all three of these regions are young, fast-growing, have decent fertility rates, populations are growing, are building new infrastructure, are becoming wealthier, have better governments than they have had. All of the right things are happening at the same time. And so when you think of Asia, you don't have to think only of China. Think of this triangle as well, and India. And then you get a sense of just how vast and important all of Asia is to your future on the other side of the planet. But let's transition and get back to complexity. It's not a linear world, right? I can be confident that Asia will keep growing. I can be confident that most of the human species will live in Asia. But we have to take into account complexity again. And one of the factors that I mentioned at the beginning driving that complexity, of course, is climate change. Now, earlier today we were talking about the heat waves that are affecting parts of the world, and no place is more affected, actually, than India, where right now they've had more than 1 month of temperatures in northern India that are above 50 degrees Celsius. I don't think it's ever been 50 degrees Celsius in Brazil. Right? There's one place in Iran where it reached 60 degrees Celsius recently. Okay. Now, not only does Asia have the most people in the world, but look here, if you take 3 countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, right? That's 1.8 billion people, right? 1 out of every 4 human beings in the world is just here, and this is the climate picture. And this is not a warning what could be in 20, 50, 25 years from now. This is last week, right? It's already there. It's already happening. So it wouldn't surprise you to know, maybe, that the largest exporter of people in the world, what Brazil is to agriculture, India is to people and software, right? You export $100-something billion in agriculture. India exports about 80 to 100 billion in software. So you export grains and cattle and protein and let's call it atoms, and India exports bits. But also carbon, human beings. The next 10 countries don't have as much emigration combined as India does. So, and of course it has the most people in the world. It has the most young people in the world. It has the worst climate profile in the world. What do you think will happen? Take these different trends and put them together, and even though we live in a complex world, some things are obvious. Right? It becomes unlivable unless they adapt. Lots of air conditioning, much better, of course, irrigation for their farms. India is an agricultural nation too, and their agriculture is suffering. The price of onions goes way up in Singapore, where I live, when you have a drought in India, right? So we are all connected through these various threads, and what's happening in one part of the world because of climate is affecting food supply, affecting prices, will affect political stability. 14 years ago, in 2010, I took a little drive. I took a little road trip. I was in the middle of England at an army base, and me and my friends decided to buy a truck. We bought a Land Rover from the British Army, a big 3-ton truck. We said, let's go for a drive. So we drove to Mongolia. It was about 14,000 kilometers. And while we were driving across Russia, there was a terrible heat wave. Now, when I was growing up, when people said Russia, you always thought it was very, very, very cold. Siberia. I was in Siberia, and there was a heat wave. And our old Jeep had no air conditioning. We were worried about it overheating. So why am I telling you this story? Because it has everything to do with agriculture. Along the way, because of climate change, Russia got hotter. Not only did Russia get hotter, but its agriculture began to thrive. And Russia had become one of the largest wheat exporters in the world. Who buys Russian wheat and who was buying Russian wheat in 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? A couple of countries called Egypt and Tunisia. So, 6 months after my sweating heat wave, which led to fires and droughts across Russia, which led to Russia banning the export of its own wheat, what happened in Egypt and Tunisia? January of 2011, the Arab Spring, the revolutions. What happened to the food and bread prices in Egypt and Tunisia? Why did the vendor in the marketplace in Tunis set himself on fire? Right? Why? Because of food, the price of food. Again, we already live in this world. This complexity is not futurism. It's already yesterday. And you know, people didn't figure out the story of the Arab Spring right away. They said, oh, well, it's just corruption. And yes, that's partially true. And when I was driving across Russia, I wasn't thinking, aha, it's really hot here. There's going to be a revolution in Egypt in 6 months. No. As I said at the beginning, it's so hard to know what will happen tomorrow as a result of the complexity. Only in 2013, 2014, people looked back, they calculated all the numbers, they saw the data, and then they said, aha, this is partially what happened. And that's how complex systems work. So the climate issue, of course, is pushing us beyond our planetary boundaries, the way we have conventionally defined them. And I think this is an area where you are very, very well educated. The Earth Summit was in Rio, right, in 1992. Brazil is a country that is, again, ground zero of climate diplomacy, but also ground zero for climate change and how it's affecting your country and the system. So every country may have its boundaries. The Amazonian basin may have its boundaries. There's an annual amount of stress that an agricultural system or a biodiverse ecosystem can handle. And that's what you are dealing with right now. That's what we are all dealing with as the world moves towards 2 degrees Celsius in terms of the temperature rise. And sadly, that is where we are going to go. There is no scenario where we meet the Paris Agreement targets, right? I go to these COP summits. That's time I will never get back, unfortunately. It's a lot of talk and very little action. And that's the problem. So now you know, and I think you already know, you have to prepare for a 2-degree world, maybe a 2.5-degree world, maybe worse. Don't be surprised with the consequences, right? Don't be surprised, because these are things that are priced in, that are baked in to the system, and we have to be very conscious. As I said, we're not going to meet the goals. $10 trillion per year is supposedly needed for climate finance, both for mitigation and for adaptation. A lot of money is going into mitigation. I am a technological optimist. I see amazing things happening with decarbonization, with electrification, with alternative energy, with renewable energy, solar, wind, nuclear, biofuels. The cost of all of them is going way, way down. Hydrogen too, everything. But not enough, too little, too late, not evenly distributed. And even if you still have the accumulated emissions in the atmosphere that are continuing to have temperature rise, and the financing for adaptation is much, much less. It's almost zero. It's practically insignificant. And that's where the money will have to go. But here's something else to think about. The reason everyone rallies behind mitigation, reducing emissions, is that it is a global public good. Everyone does benefit eventually, if we can reduce emissions to zero, if we can sequester carbon, decarbonize, that would be great. That is what is known as a global public good, something where everyone benefits. Adaptation is a local and private good. It is the opposite in some way. What that means is that when you build a seawall, when you build an irrigation system, when you build flood control, it's great for you, but it doesn't help people in Africa, it doesn't help people in Asia. And that's why at the global conferences, the global summits, people don't say, yes, yes, more adaptation. Right? They focus on the decarbonization. The truth is we need both. Because we are not stopping the emissions, we're still at 60 gigatons per year, to be clear, right, in emissions. It's still going up, not down. You must devote equal resources to adaptation, but that money is not going to come from the United Nations. It's not going to come from the World Bank. It's not going to come from Washington. You have to do it. So you, Brazil, must identify how will climate volatility affect every inch of your country, and what resources will you commit to adaptation? And I believe that is going to be a source of resilience for you. Now, this is a map of the entire human population. Let's put some of these trends together. There are 8 billion pixels on this map. Every one of you is a pixel here. I didn't forget anyone, I promise. Everyone is here. Again, you have South Asia as the most populated region. But bring in climate change and see what happens. I showed you India before. Now let's look at the whole world. Does red mean no human being can live there? No, it doesn't mean that. Because of course you still have 1.5 billion people in South Asia. So this is called the suitability index. It becomes unsuitable or less suitable. It becomes very uncomfortable. And that is certainly how you feel in places like that. Now, nobody lives in the Sahara, fine. But look at your great continent here. Look at what the climate maps are saying. Right? Look at what the climate reality is becoming, and what pressures that will have on your economy, what pressures that will have on demographics and where people live. I already gave you the example of Indians migrating outward. People in all continents will be affected. Look at even the American Southeast. The fastest growing region of America in terms of new home construction and people moving is the brightest red. People will move one way, then they'll move another way. That's the reality of a complex world. You move to one place because the taxes are low, and then you leave that place because the insurance premium goes up and the natural disasters strike. This happens all the time. This happens all the time everywhere. That's complexity. Complexity is you always have to change your mind. But this is a morally frightening picture because India, again, is just a microcosm of the young world. Imagine the world, now don't imagine, look at this. This is the world we live in today. Most of the young human beings on Earth, most of our future lives in red areas. That's right now. I don't see a roadmap out of this. I haven't read a good, United Nations or World Bank study on how to get out of this picture, because there isn't one. There is not one, right? And that's what binds us all together, is what is our solution for this? And the answer, of course, is that it's not top-down, it's bottom-up. The solution will be the result, the sum total of what you do in Brazil, what India does in India, what China does in China, what Saudi Arabia does in Saudi Arabia, what Americans do in America. Add up all the pieces, and you might be able to figure out what is going on. So I say this is the greatest collective action problem in the world, is the mismatch between where people are, where resources are, where technologies are, and where borders are. It's the first time now I'm mentioning borders. But of course, borders hold us back in many ways. They inhibit cooperation, they inhibit movement. And that's going to be something we'll have to massively overcome. Now, when we make those investments in adaptation that I am advocating, we become more resilient. This is what I do in my day-to-day job. My company, AlphaGeo, we don't just measure risk. Everyone is going to scare you. I'm scaring you probably, right? Everyone is going to say, the risk is getting terrible. What we try to do is to calculate the resilience. After you make an adaptation, after you build a seawall, after you have water desalination, after you have irrigation, after you have flood controls, after you have fire stations to put out the fires, are you more resilient versus your risk? Can you calculate it, measure it? And we do the math behind that, the difference between the risk and the resilience, in order to help governments, investors, think about what they should do today to be prepared for the shocks of tomorrow to be more resilient. And that's something every government must do, every society must do, is focus on building your resilience. And part of it is greater self-sufficiency. Greater self-sufficiency. Now, again, Brazil is incredibly fortunate. You are more or less self-sufficient in so many ways, which is almost impossible for a big country. In fact, I learned that you are really the only big country in the world that is so self-sufficient in so many areas, which is a blessing. So as much as you have challenges, you're also a role model in some ways for what other countries need to do, which is to invest more in the local or the national or the regional food, water, and energy systems as proximate, as close to themselves as possible, what some call an ecopolis, not just a petropolis, the Petropolis civilization, when energy was cheap, when we didn't care about climate, when we would ship food and fuel around the world at no extra marginal cost. That world is gone. How can we focus on more renewable, optimized, local, circular, as it's often called, systems? That's what the world needs to do. So, a final couple of points. Let's tie it all together. We have these different trends, disparate trends that some people analyze individually. Again, some people are experts in geopolitics, some people are experts in economics, some people are experts in demographics, some people are experts in technology. The real world is not so neat, is it? In the real world, you have to take it all together. You have to accept that we have collapsing geopolitical order. We have a demographic plateau that is coming, and a massive gap between old and young, that we have climate change accelerating. And if you put them all together, what is the likely next result? I have hinted at some of those outcomes and consequences. It is inevitable that we will have mass migrations. And you can even point to the directions and predict where they'll move. You know that we will need to invest more in resilience and diversify our economies, and that's going to require more technology, more innovation. I'll give you the example of how I see this sorting out. I talked about the great tragedy, the great mismatch between where people are and where resources are. We are seeing, in an uncoordinated way, the largest migrations in world history happening right now. According to the International Organization of Migration, 1/3 of all of the people in the world who have migrated outside of their home country are already because of climate. And another 1/3 because of politics, geopolitics, wars, refugee flows. And another 1/3 for economic reasons, the search for a better life, and to bridge those demographic gaps between old and young around the world. If you add it all up, by the way, that's about 300 million people. Never before have 300 million people lived outside of their home country, right? And that number keeps going up, up, up. And it's interesting because during COVID, just 4 years ago when COVID started, people said, oops, that's the end of globalization. That's the end of migration. Nobody will ever leave their home ever again, right? That's what people said 4 years ago today. Well, by the end of 2021, believe it or not, the world reached record annual migration again. You can't stop people. Can't stop people. 1 billion people crossed a border in 2021. In 2022, it was more. In 2023, it was more. And this year, again, will be more. We are a nomadic species. And the things that cause us to move, climate, war, labor shortages, all of those things are in acute phase right now. They're all becoming more intense, not less. So everything that pushes people is pushing harder than ever. And in new directions, I always have to make new maps. In directions that have never been seen in 150,000 years. Why 150,000? It's not just a big number. That is, of course, the beginning of mankind's original migrations out of Africa, about 150,000 years ago. Never in 150,000 years have people been moving in some of these patterns. If you think about it, of course, there were populations from Central Asia that came across the Bering Strait land bridge and came all the way to South America. Now, of course, you have record migration south to north. You have Asian populations moving west to Europe like never before. And you have Asian populations moving north into Central Asia and the former Soviet Union, again, like never before. These things have never happened, and they're happening now. Of course, you have the Africans pushing north across the Mediterranean Sea. You have the Asians also in West Asia. All of these, record numbers in every direction. And this is the result of complexity. If you looked at only one trend, you couldn't make this map. If you look at only at geopolitics, you would not result in this. You look only at climate, you would not get this. Look only at demographics, you will not get this. Put it all together, and this is what you get, for better or worse. But you can at least have more conviction in a way that it is what is happening because it is based on a bottom-up analysis. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What is the agenda for humanity? Well, clearly, I'm a geographer, so I think of solutions in terms of maps. And this is my map of everything. I couldn't fit anything else on this map. I tried. Here you have natural resource deposits. You have concentrations of people. You have political borders. you have roads and railways, you have electricity grids, you have internet cables. This is civilization. This is the world not as God gave it to us, not as colonialists divided it. This is the world that we have built, and the world we are building all the time. I call upon you to reprogram it. It has to be reprogrammed. It's no longer fit for purpose. Where the people are doesn't match where the resources are, doesn't match where the borders are, doesn't match where the economic activity is. It's all messed up. It's all misaligned. And there is no report coming from Mars, from Elon Musk, or from Joe Biden to fix it. Everything we do, every action you take, helps to reprogram the map. The question is, for better or for worse? If you want to make things better, you can do one of two things. You can either move people to where the resources are, where the jobs are, where they're needed, where they can contribute, where they can have a better life, where they can help economies. Or you can move technologies to where people need them. Seeds, water desalination, genetically modified crops, internet access, mobile phones, whatever it is. Either you move people to resources or technologies to people. If you do one of those two things, or both of those things, you will make a big positive contribution towards reprogramming our geography. And if we do that together, coordinated or uncoordinated, we will have a better map. We will have a better world. We'll have a more fair world, a more just world. A world where you're selling to everyone, not just to this country or that country, but you're selling to, in a way, all of civilization wherever people may be, because we will have the infrastructure, the connectivity, the markets linked, the cities connected, right? We'll overcome the political borders and divisions in our own collective interest. But I'll tell you again, nobody is going to guide you there. There is no one at the center, there is no driver at the wheel, right? It's every one of us, it's you. You are in one of the most powerful countries in the world, one of the most powerful industries in that country, and one of the most important industries in the world. I entrust you. I don't know who else will make those contributions. It's certainly yourselves. And I hope you will. And I hope that this makes a contribution towards your dialogue and your conversation about that better future. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Parag, we don't have time for questions, but in the name of all of us here at the Global Agriculture Forum, DATAGRO, and ourselves at XP, I'd like to thank you very much for your fantastic presentation and everything you do. And it's a real pleasure and honor to have you here with us. So thank you very much for making the time. And we'll hopefully have you here again in our future events, right? And yeah, thank you very much again. Muito obrigado.